has told you the same thing your whole life. When something goes wrong, think it through. Sit with it. Work it out. Go deep until you understand it completely. And most people believe that. They live by it. But here is the thing nobody warns you about. The more intensely you focus on a problem, the harder your brain actually works against you. Not because thinking is bad, because there is a specific kind of thinking, the kind most of us do automatically when something goes wrong, that does not move you forward at all. It just keeps you running in the same circle, faster and faster, getting nowhere. And by the time this video ends, you are going to understand exactly what that loop is, why your brain runs it without asking you, and most importantly, the precise mechanism that breaks it. But that mechanism is not what most people expect. Stay with me. Let me ask you something first. Have you ever spent an entire day completely exhausted, drained, foggy, flat, without doing a single physically demanding thing? Have you ever known exactly what you needed to do, seen it clearly in your mind, told yourself you would start, and then watched yourself do almost everything except that? If that is familiar, this is not about willpower. It's not about discipline or motivation or some missing character trait. It's about how your brain processes difficulty when it has never been specifically trained to do otherwise. This is Book Blueprint, and today we're going deep on one of the most important ideas you'll probably never find in a classroom, a productivity course, or a therapist's office. How to stop your mind from feeding problems and train it to move towards solutions instead. We're covering 8 chapters. Each one builds on the last. By the end, you'll have a complete framework for what happens inside your mind when a problem appears, and a clear set of tools to change how it responds. Not because your life will suddenly get easier, but because you'll stop collapsing when it gets hard. Before we get into the first chapter, there's something I need to tell you that most videos on this topic skip entirely. It changes how you understand everything that follows. I'll get there in about 60 seconds. Here is what this is not. This is not about staying positive. Positive thinking is a distraction when the problem is real. This is not about ignoring what's wrong. Clarity requires seeing things as they are, not as you wish they were. And this is definitely not about grinding harder until something breaks loose. This is about something much specific. Training the mind to respond differently when difficulty arrives. Because here's the thing most people never stop to question. The problem is almost never the real source of your exhaustion. The way your mind responds to the problem is. And that response, that mental posture toward difficulty, is not a personality trait. It's a habit, a pattern, a conditioned reflex. And habits can be changed. Let's begin. Picture 2 people. Same amount of money in the bank, same level of relationship stress, same career uncertainty, same amount of sleep the night before. One of them wakes up tomorrow morning, makes a short list, picks the first thing on it, and starts moving. The other one wakes up tomorrow morning, lies there for 20 minutes, checks their phone, drifts through the morning distracted, accomplishes very little, and finishes the day feeling worse than when it started. Same situation, completely different outcomes. Now, here is the question that matters. What is the actual difference? It is not talent. It is not intelligence. It is not that one person has fewer problems. The real difference is something far more specific, and once you see it, everything else in this video starts to make sense. The difference is this. One person treats the problem as information, something to respond to. The other person treats the problem as a verdict, something to survive. And that single distinction, how a problem is interpreted when it first appears, determines almost everything that follows. Here is a reframe that changes how you see difficulty. A problem is not a punishment. It is not proof that your life is off track or that you have somehow failed. A problem is a gap. That is all it is. A gap between where things are and where you want them to be. a gap between what exists and what is needed, a signal pointing at something that requires attention. When you see it that way, not as an attack but as a pointer, something shifts. The emotional charge weakens, the weight of it drops slightly, and suddenly you can actually think about it instead of just suffering inside it. But most minds are not trained to see problems this way. From the time we were children, we absorbed a very different message about difficulty, and that message, one most of us never consciously examine, is quietly responsible for more mental exhaustion than almost anything else. Here's what it is. From childhood onward, most of us learned that problems are connected to failure. Mistakes got punished. Struggle meant you were behind. Difficulty was treated as a sign that something was wrong with the situation, or worse, with you. So now, as an adult, when a real problem shows up, money pressure, a relationship fracturing, a career that has stalled, a direction that no longer makes sense, your nervous system does not say, here is something that needs a response. It says, danger, warning, something is wrong. And the body responds accordingly. Shoulders pull in, chest tightens, breathing goes shallow, thoughts start racing. In that state, you're not searching for a solution, you're searching for safety. And those are two completely different searches. The search for safety makes you replay the scenario over and over, hoping that one more pass through it will produce an answer. It makes you avoid making decisions because a wrong decision feels worse than no decision. It makes you seek reassurance from people who do not actually have the answers either. It makes you research, scroll, plan, and organize anything that creates the feeling of movement without requiring actual commitment. None of that is action. It mimics the shape of action, but the state underneath it is defense, not direction. Here's the piece that makes this worse. When a person's nervous system runs this defense response long enough, hours, days, sometimes weeks, the problem doesn't just stay the same size, it starts to grow. Not because anything in the external situation changed, but because of what the mind does when it stays locked in that mode. And most people never realize this is happening to them. Think about the last time you handled something difficult and came out the other side of it okay. Not perfectly, not easily, just you moved through it. You made a decision or took a step and things began to shift. In that moment, what was different? The situation was not easier. The problem was just as real, but something in your internal state was more stable, more grounded, less flooded. And in that steadier state, you could see the situation as something to work with instead of something to escape from. That's not luck. That's not talent. That's what a trained mental response looks like. The problem itself is rarely the drain. Your relationship to it is. The goal of what you're about to learn is not to eliminate difficulty from your life. That goal is both impossible and, frankly, undesirable, because every meaningful thing you've built came through navigating difficulty, not avoiding it. The goal is to build a mind that doesn't lock up when problems appear, a mind that can see the problem clearly, separate it from personal identity, ask a useful question, take one forward step. That's the whole mechanism, and it's entirely learnable. But before we get into the specific tools, there's something about the brain itself that you need to understand first. Because once you understand why your mind gravitates toward problems the way it does, you stop taking it personally. And the moment you stop taking it personally, you can start working with it instead of against it. Here is a truth that sounds counterintuitive at first, but becomes obvious once you sit with it. The problem is not what is draining you. The problem is rarely even what is making you anxious. What is draining you is the resistance, the emotional friction of being at war with the fact that the problem exists. When a problem gets treated as an enemy, something that must disappear before life can be okay again, the mind spends more energy fighting the existence of the situation than it ever spends on actually addressing it. Fighting reality is an expensive habit, because once you accept that the problem is real, that it is here, that it arrived not to punish you but because something needs adjusting, you stop spending energy on resistance. That energy becomes available for movement. And movement, even imperfect movement, changes everything. Not because the situation is solved, but because momentum is evidence that you are not trapped. And the mind responds to that evidence. In the next chapter, we are going to look at something that will either confuse you or completely change how you see your own thinking. Because it turns out that your brain's tendency to fixate on problems is not a flaw. It is a feature, a very old, very specific feature that is currently causing problems in a world it was never designed for. Let me ask you something that might feel uncomfortably familiar. Have you ever noticed that you can know completely, intellectually, without any doubt, that a specific worry is not worth the energy you are spending on it, and still find yourself thinking about it every 20 minutes? You tell yourself to stop. You do something else. You distract yourself. And 15 minutes later, there it is. Same thought, same loop, same heaviness. Most people assume this means they are weak, or broken, or just wired for anxiety. But here's what is actually happening, and it has nothing to do with weakness. It has everything to do with a survival system that evolved over thousands of years for a completely different world than the one you live in now. Understanding this is the single most important shift for anyone who has ever felt stuck in their own head. Your brain's primary job, the job it inherited from hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution, is not to make you happy. It is not to help you think clearly. It is to keep you alive. And in the environment where that brain evolved, staying alive required one skill above almost everything else: detecting what could go wrong before it did. The people who survived were not the most optimistic. They were the most vigilant. The ones whose brains constantly scanned for threats, remembered which places were dangerous, and stayed alert even when things felt okay. That wiring is still inside you, completely intact, running constantly. So when a problem appears in your life, an unpaid bill, a conversation that ended badly, and uncertainty about your direction, your brain does not ask, "Is worrying about this useful?" It asks, "Is this familiar? Is this known? Have I been here before?" And the answer is usually yes. So it returns, not to help you, to protect you. Repetition is the brain's way of saying, "I am staying close to this because a known threat is safer than an unknown one." But here is the trap inside that, and it is one of the most damaging mental patterns most people experience without ever naming it. I'll explain exactly why in a moment, but first, you need to know something about what repetitive problem thinking actually does to your cognitive ability over time. When you focus on a problem, when you go into it, let yourself really sit inside the anxiety of it, your brain releases a cascade of stress hormones. Adrenaline, cortisol, the exact same chemical cocktail designed to sharpen your reaction time when a genuine physical threat appears. Those hormones do something in the short term that feels useful. They make everything feel urgent and important. They create a sharpened sense of focus, a feeling of being alert, engaged, serious. That intensity feels like productivity. It mimics the feeling of doing something that matters. But here is what those same stress hormones do over sustained periods. They shut down the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain responsible for nuanced decision-making, creative thinking, seeing multiple options, planning, and making sound judgment calls. The longer you stay in that state, the less access you have to the very cognitive tools you need to address the problem. This is the loop, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Your brain returns to the problem to feel prepared, but the longer it stays there, the less capable of preparation it actually becomes. The state that feels like engagement is the state that prevents resolution. And there is one more layer to this, the most subtle one, and the one that explains why some problems seem to outlast any logical reason they should. This one surprised me the first time I came across it. It has to do with what happens to identity when a problem gets enough of your attention over time. When a problem receives sustained attention, when you talk about it, revisit it, explain it to other people, think through it during commutes and late nights, something starts to happen that almost nobody notices in real time. The problem begins to merge with your sense of who you are. You stop being someone who has a challenge, you become someone who is defined by one. That shift is subtle. It does not feel like it is happening. But once a problem becomes part of your identity, once it becomes part of the story you tell about your life and what has happened to you, letting go of it starts to feel like losing part of yourself. So the mind resists resolution, not consciously, quietly. This is why some problems linger far beyond their natural lifespan. The mind is not holding on because it cannot figure out a solution. It's holding on because releasing the problem would require updating the story. Some call this conditioned helplessness, some call it a narrative identity. Whatever you call it, the effect is the same. The moment you recognize that your fixation on a problem is a conditioned pattern, not a sign of seriousness, not a sign of intelligence, not an indication that the problem deserves it, something shifts. You are no longer fighting your mind for control. You are watching it from a step back. And from that step back, something becomes possible that has been unavailable inside the loop. In the next chapter, I'm going to give you the most practical mental tool in this entire video, one you can apply literally tonight. But first, I need to establish one more piece, because without it, the tool doesn't land the way it should. Here is the core question to start asking yourself when you notice the loop starting again. Not, why can't I stop thinking about this? But instead, what does my mind gain by staying here? That question does the thing that most approaches to anxiety and overthinking fail to do. It does not try to suppress the thought or argue with it. It simply makes the mechanism visible. And when a mechanism becomes visible, when you can see it operating, it loses much of its automatic power over you. The brain is not running this pattern because it is broken, it is running it because it was trained to. And what has been trained can be retrained. That retraining begins with understanding the second major source of mental suffering, which is not the problem itself, and not even your emotional response to it. It is the story your mind builds on top of both. There is a distinction that most people have never been taught to make, and the absence of it is responsible for more unnecessary suffering than almost any other single gap in how we are taught to think. Here it is. What happens to you and what your mind says about what happens to you are two completely different things. Nearly all emotional pain lives in the second category. The event is rarely the problem, the interpretation is. And the gap between those two things, the space between what actually occurred and what the mind immediately constructed around it, that is where anxiety, paralysis, and the specific kind of exhaustion that sleep does not fix, all of it lives there. Stay with me as I show you exactly how this works. Let me use a simple scenario. You send an important message. You wait, no reply comes. That is the event. 4 observable words. They did not respond. Now watch what the mind does with that 4-word fact. They are ignoring me. I must have said something wrong. They don't respect my time. This always happens. Nobody takes me seriously. I'm falling behind everyone else, and this is just more evidence. Not one of those statements came from the event. Every single one came from your mind filling in gaps, using past wounds, current fears, and well-worn narrative patterns to make an incomplete situation feel complete. And here's the thing that makes this so damaging. Once the story starts running, you do not feel the anxiety of the story. You feel it as though it were the anxiety of the event itself. The emotion becomes evidence that the story is accurate, which is why people say, I can't stop feeling this way. They are right. As long as the story remains intact and unexamined, the emotion that the story generates will keep regenerating. Here is what changes that, and I want to be clear, this is not a mindset trick. This is not positivity reframing. What I am about to describe is a practical, evidence-based method for separating what is real from what your mind constructed around what is real. The difference between those two things, once you actually see it on paper, is usually shocking. The practice is this. When something triggers a strong emotional response, when your chest tightens and your thoughts start racing, stop. Do not try to think through it yet. Just do this one thing first. Write down what literally happened. Not how it felt, not what it means, not what you think was behind it. Just the observable, factual sequence of events. No adjectives, no predictions, no interpretations. Just what would be captured if a security camera had recorded the moment. That is the fact. Then, on a completely separate part of the page, write down everything your mind is saying about what happened. All of it. The assumptions, the predictions, the worst-case conclusions, the meaning being assigned to the event. Let it all come out. That is the story. When people do this for the first time, most of them are genuinely surprised. The fact list is usually 2 or 3 lines. The story list fills the page. And almost all of the emotional weight, almost all of the suffering is attached to things on the second list that have not been confirmed, tested, or verified in any way. There is something in the story that makes it feel completely real even when it is not. There are specific words that show up in the story language that reveal it. Once you know what to look for, you start catching it automatically. Here's what to watch for. The story uses absolute language. This always happens to me. I never get this right. Nobody understands. Everything is falling apart. Reality does not work in absolutes. Problems are almost never permanent, universal, or total, but stories love extremes because extremes feel more certain than the uncomfortable middle ground of not knowing. When you hear those words in your own thinking, always, never, everyone, nothing, everything, that's your signal. You have left the fact and entered the narrative. And the narrative is a place where solutions cannot be accessed, because in the narrative, the conclusion is already built in. The outcome is already predetermined. There is no room left for different information. Here's what shifts when you strip the story back to the fact. First, the emotional intensity drops. Not because anything external changed, but because you have removed the amplification. The exaggeration is what creates the weight, not the raw event. Second, options appear. Inside the full story, everything feels closed, inevitable, stuck, hopeless. But when you bring the situation back down to just the actual observable facts, paths forward become visible that the narrative was completely covering. There's one more thing to notice about stories, and this one is the most important to understand for anyone who has ever felt like their thoughts are out of control. It has to do with what happens when you try to suppress a story or argue with it directly. Most people, when they notice they're spinning a negative story about something, try one of 2 things. They try to suppress it, push it down, distract themselves, tell themselves to stop being dramatic. Or they try to argue with it, counter every negative statement with a positive one, reason themselves out of the feeling, convince themselves it's not that bad. Neither works well. And here's why. Both strategies require engaging with the story. Arguing with a thought is still attention. Suppression is still attention. You're still pointing mental resources at the exact thing you're trying to diminish. The effective move is different. It is quieter. You notice the story, not to fight it, but to name it. This is a story my mind is building around an uncertain situation. My mind does this. It is not a document of what is true. It is a draft. That framing does not eliminate the story. It reduces its authority. And when the authority of the story drops, the grip of the emotion it generates drops with it. Facts are specific. Stories are dramatic. Only one of them is real. Strategic thinking does not ask why this is happening. It asks what information is present. One direction drains you. The other restores capacity. That distinction is everything. In the next chapter, we are going to look at the specific state that makes all of this possible and why most people have the sequence completely backwards when they try to think their way through a problem. There is a belief so deeply embedded in how most high-achieving, ambitious people operate that almost none of them ever examine it. It goes like this. When something goes wrong, the right response is to stay emotionally engaged, stay urgent, stay fired up, because if you calm down, you might miss something. You might stop caring enough to fix it. Calming down in this framework is for people who do not take things seriously. And that belief, that framework, is not just wrong, it's one of the most expensive mental errors that driven, capable people make, and it's costing them time, clarity, energy, and outcomes every single day. Here's the biology of why. When your nervous system registers threat, real or perceived, it activates a system that redirects resources. Blood flow shifts away from the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that handles planning, nuanced thinking, creativity, seeing multiple options simultaneously, and making sound decisions, and routes it toward faster, more reactive systems. The heart rate increases, breathing becomes shallow, muscles tense, perception narrows. In a physical emergency, this is a brilliant response. You don't need creativity when a car is swerving at you, you need reaction speed. But when you are trying to figure out what to do about your finances, your career, your relationship, or your direction in life, reaction speed is the last thing you need. You need access to precisely the cognitive tools that stress is shutting down. This is not a metaphor, it is measurable physiology. Which is why decisions made in high emotional states are so frequently regretted later, not because you were weak or reckless, because you were operating with significantly reduced access to the brain systems responsible for sound judgment. There's a version of this that most people experience so regularly they have stopped noticing it. If this sounds familiar, you'll know exactly what I mean. It is the specific feeling of knowing, completely knowing what you should do and being entirely unable to make yourself do it. Not because you're lazy, because of something much more specific than that. Think about the last time you were emotionally flooded, overwhelmed, anxious, running hot with frustration or fear. In that state, what was your thinking like? Probably repetitive, the same scenarios running in rotation. Your body tense, your jaw tight, your breathing fast and shallow. In that state, even genuinely good advice sounds useless or irritating. Even options that are obviously available feel inaccessible. Even people who care about you and want to help seem unable to reach you. That's not a character flaw. That's your prefrontal cortex operating at reduced capacity because the stress system has redirected its resources. And here's what most people do in that state. They try harder, they push more, they think faster and deeper and with more intensity, hoping that somewhere in that extra effort, clarity will appear. It does not work, because you cannot think your way out of a stress state by generating more stress. Here's the sequence most people have exactly backwards, and reversing it is one of the most immediately useful things in this entire framework. This single reorder changes how fast you can access solutions when pressure is high. Most people operate this way: solve the problem first, then feel calm. They believe calm will arrive as a result of resolution, and sometimes it does. But that sequence makes you entirely dependent on external circumstances to determine your internal state, which means every new problem resets you back to zero. The sequence that actually works is the reverse. Calm first, then clarity, then action. Not action to earn calm. Calm first as a deliberate, intentional act so that the thinking required for effective action becomes available. This does not mean ignoring the problem. It does not mean pretending things are fine. It does not mean lowering your standards or reducing your commitment. It means understanding that commitment without clarity produces wasted motion, and clarity requires a settled enough state to access it. Here's what settling actually looks like in practice, and I want to be specific because this is not about long meditation sessions or breathing exercises you'll never actually use. When you notice emotional activation rising, and you'll notice it in the body first before the thoughts escalate, you do three things. 1. Slow your breathing deliberately. Exhale longer than you inhale, 3 or 4 breath cycles. This is not symbolic. It triggers the parasympathetic nervous system and begins to downshift the stress response. 2. Relax the physical tension you can locate: jaw, shoulders, hands. Tension in the body maintains tension in the mind. Releasing the physical grip releases some of the mental grip. 3. Name what you're feeling, not dramatically, just internally, specifically. This is anxiety. This is frustration. This is fear. Labeling an emotion activates the prefrontal cortex, the exact system you need, and reduces the intensity of the emotional signal. Now here's the objection most analytical, driven people raise at this point, and I want to address it directly because if I don't, it will quietly block you from using any of this. The objection sounds like this: if I calm down, I will stop caring. I will lose my edge. The urgency is what makes me take things seriously. Let's deal with that directly. Emotion is not commitment. Intensity is not effectiveness. The most capable people in the highest stakes environments, surgeons, pilots, special forces operators, crisis negotiators, do not perform their best work in a state of emotional flooding. They perform it in a state of calm engagement, alert but settled, serious but regulated. Caring about something does not require suffering through it. You can be deeply committed to resolving something and still be calm enough to think about it clearly. In fact, the calmer you are about something important, the more likely you are to actually do it well. Some people call this emotional regulation. Some call it composure. Some call it keeping your head. Whatever you call it, it is not a personality trait. It is a skill, a trainable, practicable, improvable skill. And in the next chapter, we are going to look at what that skill looks like when it is applied specifically to finding a way forward. Because once the state is settled, something becomes available that was completely inaccessible inside the emotional storm. You do not gain clarity by pushing harder through the noise. You gain it by lowering the volume first. If you have ever been around someone who handles pressure well, someone who faces the same chaos everyone else faces but stays clear, moves decisively, recovers quickly, you've probably had one of two thoughts. Either they are built differently. Something in them is wired for this that isn't wired in me. Or they must have an easier life, fewer real problems, less actual pressure. Both of those assumptions are understandable, and both of them are wrong in a way that matters a great deal, because they are protecting a belief that, as long as it stays in place, makes genuine change impossible. Here's what's actually different about those people, and it has nothing to do with personality or circumstances. The people who move through difficulty with calm and direction are not running on different hardware. They have trained a different operating system. Specifically, they have trained their mind to ask different questions when difficulty appears. Not because they are smarter, but because they have learned, consciously or through accumulated experience, that certain types of thinking produce traction and certain types do not. And they have built a habit of reaching for the former. That habit is called solution-oriented thinking, and like any habit, it follows a pattern, a structure, a set of moves that can be identified, practiced, and internalized. Here is the first and most fundamental distinction. Problem-oriented thinking moves backward. It asks what went wrong, who is at fault, why this keeps happening, what it means. Solution-oriented thinking moves forward. It asks what is available right now, what can be done today, what the next smallest step looks like. That forward orientation sounds simple, almost too simple to matter. But here's what most people do not realize about it, and this is the part that changes everything about how quickly they begin making progress when they finally get it. You cannot generate forward movement by looking backward. Not because understanding the past is useless, sometimes it is genuinely important to understand why something happened, but because the past is fixed. Nothing you can think about it will change it. The present is where action exists, and action is the only thing that changes your trajectory. Solution-oriented thinking does not deny the past. It simply doesn't live there. It asks, given everything that is true right now, what is the smallest, most actionable step available to me? Not the perfect step, not the final step, the next one, the one that is actually doable today. This matters enormously because of a truth most people have exactly backwards about the relationship between clarity and action. Most people believe clarity must arrive before action, that you need to understand the situation fully, feel ready, feel confident, have a clear picture of the path before you start moving. But clarity almost never arrives before action. Clarity emerges because of action, and because it is counterintuitive in a way that has real consequences. If you have been waiting to feel ready before you start, if you have been waiting for the path to clarify before you take the first step, you have been waiting for something that will only appear after you move. And that is a waiting game you cannot win. Here is what actually happens when you take a step, even an imperfect one, even a small one. Your nervous system registers something very specific. I moved. I am not trapped. I can take a step. That signal changes your state, not dramatically, not all at once, but reliably. Energy that was locked in the paralysis of rumination becomes available for the next step. Focus that was scattered across worst-case scenarios begins to consolidate. The thinking that felt clouded and circular starts to organize itself around the forward direction. This is why solution-oriented thinking always starts small. Not because the problem is small, but because small actions break the paralysis, and breaking the paralysis is the first requirement for everything else. There is another element of this that rarely gets discussed. Solution-oriented thinking has a fundamentally different relationship with failure. Problem-oriented minds treat failures as verdicts. An attempt that did not work is evidence of inadequacy. It means the risk was not worth taking. It means next time, the threshold before moving must be even higher. Solution-oriented minds treat outcomes, all outcomes, including the ones that did not go as planned, as data. Not metaphorically, literally. What worked in this attempt? What did not? What needs to change for the next one? And this shift, from verdict to data, is not about being soft on yourself or lowering your standards. It's about something much more important. When failure becomes data, the cost of taking action drops. If the worst case is that you gain information about what does not work, that is useful. That is actually progress. It has narrowed the space of what to try next. When failure becomes data, the willingness to move before certainty is established increases dramatically. And when willingness increases, momentum builds. And when momentum builds, trust in your own capacity compounds. This is not a motivational speech, it's a description of a mechanical process. Identify the smallest available step. Take it. Collect the result. Adjust. Take the next step. Repeat. Some people call this bias for action. Some call it a growth mindset. Some people just call it getting on with things. Whatever label it gets, the process underneath is trainable. It's practicable, and it's available to anyone willing to start before they feel ready. There is one final note before we move to the next chapter. Not every problem requires immediate action. Part of solution-oriented thinking is knowing when to wait, when to gather more information, when to let a situation clarify, when more time genuinely helps. But there is a difference between intentional waiting and avoidance. Intentional waiting has a clear purpose and a clear endpoint. You know what you are waiting for and when you will act. Avoidance has neither. It just waits, indefinitely, because moving feels riskier than staying still. The next chapter is about a practice that makes solution-oriented thinking more automatic. It is about the specific questions your mind asks by default when something goes wrong, and what happens when you replace them. This is the chapter that tends to land hardest for people. Not because the ideas are complicated, because of how uncomfortable it is to realize how much time you have spent asking questions that were working against you. Here is the foundation. Your mind follows questions like a search engine follows a query. Whatever you ask, your mind goes looking for an answer, and it will find one, whether that answer is accurate, helpful, or completely fabricated from fear and past experience. The quality of the question determines the quality of the search. And most people have never once examined the questions their mind defaults to under pressure. When something goes wrong in your life, at work, in a relationship, financially, personally. What does This is worth sitting with for a second because it is counterintuitive in a way that has real consequences. If you have been waiting to feel ready before you start, if you have been waiting for the path to clarify before you take the first step, you have been waiting for something that will only appear after you move. And that is a waiting game you cannot win. Here is what actually happens when you take a step, even an imperfect one, even a small one. Your nervous system registers something very specific. I moved. I am not trapped. I can take a step. That signal changes your state, not dramatically, not all at once, but reliably. Energy that was locked in the paralysis of rumination becomes available for the next step. Focus that was scattered across worst-case scenarios begins to consolidate. The thinking that felt clouded and circular starts to organize itself around the forward direction. This is why solution-oriented thinking always starts small. Not because the problem is small, but because small actions break the paralysis, and breaking the paralysis is the first requirement for everything else. There is another element of this that rarely gets discussed. Solution-oriented thinking has a fundamentally different relationship with failure. Problem-oriented minds treat failures as verdicts. An attempt that did not work is evidence of inadequacy. It means the risk was not worth taking. It means next time, the threshold before moving must be even higher. Solution-oriented minds treat outcomes, all outcomes, including the ones that did not go as planned, as data. Not metaphorically, literally. What worked in this attempt? What did not? What needs to change for the next one? And this shift, from verdict to data, is not about being soft on yourself or lowering your standards. It's about something much more important. When failure becomes data, the cost of taking action drops. If the worst case is that you gain information about what does not work, that is useful. That is actually progress. It has narrowed the space of what to try next. When failure becomes data, the willingness to move before certainty is established increases dramatically. And when willingness increases, momentum builds. And when momentum builds, trust in your own capacity compounds. This is not a motivational speech. It's a description of a mechanical process. Identify the smallest available step. Take it. Collect the result. Adjust. Take the next step. Repeat. Some people call this bias for action. Some call it a growth mindset. Some people just call it getting on with things. Whatever label it gets, the process underneath is trainable, it's practicable, and it's available to anyone willing to start before they feel ready. There is one final note before we move to the next chapter. Not every problem requires immediate action. Part of solution-oriented thinking is knowing when to wait, when to gather more information, when to let a situation clarify, when more time genuinely helps. But there is a difference between intentional waiting and avoidance. Intentional waiting has a clear purpose and a clear endpoint. You know what you are waiting for and when you will act. Avoidance has neither. It just waits, indefinitely, because moving feels riskier than staying still. The next chapter is about a practice that makes solution-oriented thinking more automatic. It is about the specific questions your mind asks by default when something goes wrong, and what happens when you replace them. This is the chapter that tends to land hardest for people. Not because the ideas are complicated, because of how uncomfortable it is to realize how much time you have spent asking questions that were working against you. Here is the foundation. Your mind follows questions like a search engine follows a query. Whatever you ask, your mind goes looking for an answer, and it will find one, whether that answer is accurate, helpful, or completely fabricated from fear and past experience. The quality of the question determines the quality of the search. And most people have never once examined the questions their mind defaults to under pressure. When something goes wrong in your life, at work, in a relationship, financially, personally, what does your mind automatically ask? For most people, the default questions sound something like this. Why does this always happen to me? Why can't I just get my life together? What is wrong with me that I keep ending up here? Why is this so much harder for me than for everyone else? Those questions feel honest. They feel like self-reflection. They feel like you are taking responsibility. But notice what they have in common. Not one of them points anywhere useful. Every single one of them is pointed backward, inward, or into abstraction. Every single one of them is looking for explanation, not direction. And explanation by itself changes nothing. There is something else about those questions that makes them uniquely damaging, something most people never realize is happening while they ask them. Look at the questions again. Why do I always end up here? Assumes it is always happening. What is wrong with me? Assumes something is wrong. Why can't I get this right? Assumes you can't. The question contains the conclusion. Before any investigation has been done, before any evidence has been examined, the question has already decided the outcome. This is not self-awareness. This is self-accusation dressed up as reflection. And a mind that spends significant time answering questions like these is not building insight. It is accumulating evidence of a story it already decided to tell about itself. Now compare those to a different set of questions. What is actually in my control right now? What is the one thing, if I addressed it today, that would reduce the most pressure? What is the smallest available step forward? What have I been avoiding that I already know needs to happen? Those questions do not feel as dramatic. They do not carry the same emotional weight as the first set. And that is exactly why many people resist them. They feel too mundane, too practical, too small for the size of what they are dealing with. But here's what those questions do that the dramatic ones never can. They point somewhere. Every one of them contains a direction, a path, an entry point into movement. They do not ask you to explain your life. They ask you to engage with it. And engagement, even minimal, uncertain engagement, restores something that the explanation spiral reliably destroys: agency. The feeling of being someone who acts on things, rather than someone things happen to. When you ask a better question, you change more than you're thinking. You change your posture toward the situation. You shift from victim to respondent. That is not a small thing. That shift is where almost all meaningful forward motion begins. Let's talk about a specific category of question that deserves its own attention: certainty questions. What if this goes wrong? What if I fail? What if I make the wrong decision? These feel like responsible, cautious thinking. They feel like due diligence. But here's what they are actually doing, and why they are among the most dangerous questions ambitious, driven people regularly ask themselves. Certainty questions create a demand for certainty before movement. And certainty before movement is something meaningful progress almost never offers. Every important step you have ever taken, the ones that actually shaped your life, happened without certainty. You did not know how the job would go when you started it. You did not know how the relationship would develop when it began. You did not know if the risk would pay off when you took it. You moved, things clarified, you adjusted. That's how progress works. Certainty questions do not prepare you for that reality. They make you demand something different, a guarantee that the territory will be safe before you enter it. And since that guarantee never comes, you stay at the edge. A more useful version of those questions: instead of what if I fail, ask what would I learn if this approach didn't work. Instead of what if I make the wrong choice, ask which option moves me forward, even slightly, from where I currently am. Those reframes do not minimize risk. They stop treating risk as a reason to stay still. There is one final category of question worth addressing specifically, and it is the one most likely to quietly undermine everything else in this video if it stays unexamined. These are questions that most analytical, ambitious people ask themselves regularly while believing they are doing the responsible, self-aware thing. Identity-damaging questions. Why am I like this? Why can't I be better? What is fundamentally wrong with the way I think? These questions feel like honest self-examination. They feel like you are holding yourself accountable. But notice what they are actually asking. They are not asking about a situation, they are asking about your fundamental nature. They are assuming that what is difficult about the current situation is evidence of a permanent personal deficiency. And a mind that routinely answers questions like these does not build clarity, it builds shame. Shame is what happens when a mistake becomes an identity instead of an event. And shame turns attention inward, away from the situation, away from the possible steps, away from anything actionable, and keeps it focused on the internal verdict. Replace "what does this say about me" with "what does this require from me?" One is a mirror pointed at your wounds, the other is a map pointed at the next move. Both feel like reflection, only one produces direction. The final question, the most important one, is also the most avoided. What am I not doing that I already know I should be doing? Most people spend enormous energy on analysis, planning, research, and consideration as a way of circling around this question without ever landing on it. But the answer is almost always already there. You know. You probably knew before you started watching this video. Name it, write it down, and then in the next chapter, we are going to look at how to make sure your attention actually supports doing it. Everything in the previous 6 chapters requires one thing to actually work: directed attention. Not motivated attention, not inspired attention, not the kind of attention you have after a good night's sleep or a particularly energizing morning. Deliberate, trained attention, available even when you were tired, even when you were stressed, even when the pull toward distraction and rumination is at its strongest. Attention is not something you have or you don't. It is something you have been training or accidentally letting atrophy every day for years. And most people, when they understand this, realize they have been training it in exactly the wrong direction. Here is what that means and how to change it. Attention follows the path of least resistance. When left unguided, it moves toward whatever is most emotionally charged, most uncertain, most unresolved, which almost always means it moves toward the problem. Not because the problem deserves it, because the problem is loud, because it is familiar, because the mind has been conditioned to orbit around it. This is why you can sit down to work on something important and find yourself 15 minutes in thinking about a completely unrelated concern. Why you can lie down to rest and end up mentally rehearsing an argument you had 3 days ago. Why you can be in a conversation with someone who matters to you and be only partially present because part of your mind is still parked on something that happened that morning. That is not weakness. That is unmanaged attention behaving the way unmanaged attention behaves. It goes with a pull is strongest. The good news, and there is genuinely good news here, is that the mechanism for training attention is not complicated. It does not require hours of practice. It does not require conditions to be perfect. It requires one thing: noticing the drift and returning. That is the entire practice. But how you do that returning matters more than most people realize. The most effective tool for managing attention around problems is something called containment. Here's how it works. Most people allow problems to exist everywhere in their mental space. Problems show up at work, at the dinner table, during conversations, in the shower, at 2 in the morning. They have no boundaries, no borders, no designated time and place. They roam. Containment means giving the problem a specific place. You decide, this situation gets my focused attention during this specific window. Inside that window, maybe 30 minutes, maybe an hour, you think about it fully. You write, you plan, you make decisions, you identify the next step. Outside that window, when the thought appears, and it will appear, you do not engage with it. You simply remind yourself, this has already been scheduled. It does not need my attention right now. This is not avoidance. Avoidance is when you never actually engage with the problem. Containment is when you engage with it deliberately, on your terms, during a designated window, rather than letting it show up and demand your attention at random intervals throughout your entire day and night. Containment trains the mind to respect structure. Over time, the ambient presence of the problem in your day-to-day consciousness diminishes, not because it has been resolved, but because it has been given a place, and the mind can release what it knows has been acknowledged. There's a related principle that is even more counterintuitive, and one that most people do the exact opposite of when they're trying to get free of obsessive or anxious thoughts. Understanding this one principle makes the single biggest difference in how much mental space problems consume on a daily basis. Attention is nutrition for mental patterns. Whatever you consistently direct attention toward, whether that is gratitude, creativity, anxiety, or rumination, that pattern grows stronger, more automatic, more capable of grabbing your attention without asking. This is not a metaphor. It is how neural pathways work. Which means every hour you spend in anxious thought about a problem is not an hour spent working on the problem. It is an hour spent making anxious thought more automatic and more accessible the next time something similar appears. You are training the pattern, whether you intend to or not. Conversely, every time you redirect your attention away from an anxious loop, not by arguing with it, not by suppressing it, but by simply noticing it and placing your attention somewhere else, you are doing the opposite. You are reducing the pattern's hold. Not dramatically, not all at once, but consistently. Every redirect is one repetition in the opposite direction. The most common mistake people make when trying to break a rumination loop is one that actually makes it worse. It is such a natural, understandable mistake that most people do it repeatedly without ever realizing why it is not helping. Here is what it is: arguing with the thought. When a worrying thought appears, the instinct is to counter it, to reason yourself out of it, to say, "This isn't as bad as I think. Look, here's evidence that it'll be okay. Stop catastrophizing." This approach is well-intentioned, and it is unhelpful, because engaging with the thought, even to argue against it, is still engagement. The thought is still receiving attention, and attention is what keeps patterns running. The effective move is quieter. Notice the thought, acknowledge that it is there, do not engage with its content, and deliberately redirect your attention to something concrete that is directly in front of you. Not because the thought doesn't matter, but because engaging with it right now produces nothing useful, and things that produce nothing useful do not deserve your finite mental resources. The practice is simply notice, do not follow, return. One repetition. And every repetition builds exactly the kind of attention that can work with difficulty rather than being pulled around by it. There is one last piece worth naming before we get to the final chapter: mental residue. This is what happens when you move on from a problem without giving your mind any form of closure, without writing down the next step, making one small decision, or, at minimum, acknowledging that you know what the situation requires. The mind keeps the loop running because the loop is open. An open problem is an uncompleted task, and the mind treats uncompleted tasks the way an unfinished sentence treats your reading. It cannot let go until it has a period. Close the loop, even minimally. Write the next step, set a reminder for when you will address it, make the smallest available decision. Tell your mind, this has been acknowledged, it will be handled. Not now, but it is scheduled. The mind releases what has been acknowledged far more easily than what has been left hanging open. Where your attention goes, everything else follows. Train it deliberately. In the final chapter, we bring everything together into something more permanent than any single technique. There's a version of this video where you walk away having collected 8 useful ideas. You understand the brain chemistry. You have the 2-column exercise for separating facts from stories. You know the 3-breath technique. You have the better questions, the containment method, the forward orientation. And that's genuinely valuable. But here's what most people who consume this kind of content discover if they're honest with themselves. Knowing the techniques does not automatically change the behavior. Insight alone does not produce consistent change, because the behavior under pressure doesn't come from what you know, it comes from something much deeper. And until that deeper layer shifts, the techniques stay theoretical. Here is exactly what that layer is. It is identity. Specifically, who you believe you are at a fundamental level, underneath the strategies, underneath the intentions, underneath the knowledge. When pressure arrives, when something goes wrong in a real and urgent way, you do not stop and consult your notes. You become who you believe you are. If your operating identity, the one running in the background below conscious thought, is someone who gets overwhelmed by things like this, then when the overwhelm arrives, your behavior will automatically organize itself around that self-image. Not because you chose it, because the identity runs faster than the choice. This is why you can know exactly what to do and still default to the old pattern under stress. The old pattern is not in your knowledge, it is in your identity. So here's the question that matters. What identity are you carrying right now? Not the one you would prefer, not the one you perform in your best moments. The one that shows up when things go wrong, when the problem is real and the stakes are high. Do you become someone who panics, someone who freezes, someone who avoids and delays, someone who replays and ruminates until exhaustion forces a stop? Or do you become someone different? And here's the important thing. That question is not about personality. It is not about the hand you were dealt. It is about the evidence you have accumulated, or not yet accumulated, about who you are when things get hard. And evidence is something you can start generating today. Identity is not declared, it is demonstrated. You do not decide to become someone who handles things. You become that person by handling things, imperfectly, incrementally, without waiting for confidence to arrive first, until the evidence of your own behavior shifts the story you carry about yourself. That is the entire process. Every time you pause before spiraling, one piece of evidence. Every time you separate the fact from the story, one piece of evidence. Every time you ask a forward question instead of a backward one piece of evidence. Every time you take one small step instead of freezing, one piece of evidence. None of those moments feel significant in isolation. They are not dramatic. They will not produce a clean before and after transformation you can point to at the end of a single day. But they accumulate. And as they accumulate, something changes at the foundation. Your nervous system starts expecting that when something appears, you will handle it. Not perfectly, not without discomfort, but consistently, reliably, forward. That expectation is the most powerful thing this entire framework is building toward. Here's what changes when that expectation becomes the default. And this is the piece that most people who spend years in self-improvement content never reach, because they keep working at the level of technique without ever updating the level of identity. When your identity shifts from someone who struggles with difficulty to someone who responds to difficulty, the questions you ask automatically change. You stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" You start asking, "What does this require from me?" You stop asking, "When will this be over?" You start asking, "What is the next step?" You stop asking, "Am I capable of this?" You start asking, "How do I approach this?" Those questions feel completely different to ask, not because you forced them, because they are now consistent with who you believe you are. And when identity and behavior are aligned, when what you do matches who you believe yourself to be, no willpower is required to maintain it. It simply runs. This identity has specific characteristics worth naming. It does not require things to be easy. It expects engagement with things that are not easy. It does not demand certainty before moving. It accepts uncertainty as the standard condition of forward movement. It does not treat mistakes as verdicts. It treats them as information about the next adjustment should be. It does not swing between blaming everything on circumstances or blaming everything on itself. It occupies a middle position. I did not choose everything that happened here, but I am the one who chooses what happens next. This identity is also not fragile. It does not require things to go well to stay intact. And that's the key difference between this and simple motivation or confidence. Motivation and confidence are dependent on conditions. This identity is not. Here's why. Motivation rises when things are going well and falls when they are not. Confidence arrives after a success and retreats after a setback. But identity, once it has been built through enough accumulated evidence, holds when conditions shift. It holds because it is not based on outcomes. It is based on a pattern of behavior. I am someone who responds. That statement does not require the response to have worked. It requires only that you responded. This is the difference between a person who feels capable only when things go well and a person who feels capable in the middle of things going wrong. There is one final thing about this identity worth naming, and this is the thing that will make this video worth rewatching. It is not something most people realize until they have already begun building it, but once they do, they understand why nothing else in the self-improvement space ever quite landed the way they hoped. This identity, the one we have been building toward across this entire video, lives in sequence. Not in grand transformation, not in the resolution of every problem, not in finally achieving the life that makes difficulty stop. In sequence. One step, then the next, then the one after that. The problem-oriented identity is always trying to solve everything at once. It carries every unresolved thing simultaneously. It tries to plan for every possible future. It cannot commit to a direction because it is trying to cover all directions at the same time. The solution-oriented identity is different. What matters right now? Just that. What is the one next reasonable move? Just that. This is not settling, it is efficiency. It is the recognition that the mind moving in one direction at full capacity will always outperform the mind moving in 6 directions at divided capacity. Sequence creates momentum. Momentum creates evidence. Evidence builds identity. And a solid identity, one that knows it handles things, that knows it responds rather than reacts, that knows it moves even when uncertainty is present, changes the entire emotional experience of being alive. Not because life becomes easier, because you become more capable of meeting life as it actually is. The goal is not a life without problems. It is a mind that doesn't collapse when they appear. When a problem appears now, after this, who do you become? The answer to that question is not fixed. It is practiced. Come back to where we started. You were told your whole life to think through your problems. Go deep. Stay with it until you understand it fully. And you have now seen why that instinct, well-intentioned, reasonable-sounding, quietly works against you when it becomes the default response to every difficulty that arrives. Thinking harder about a problem from inside an emotionally activated state does not produce clarity. It produces more activation, more looping, more of the exact thing you were trying to escape. What you have learned across these 8 chapters is a different kind of response. You learned that problems are not sentences. They are signals pointing at something that needs attention, not at something that is wrong with you. You learned that your brain's tendency to orbit difficulty is not a flaw. It is a survival mechanism from a world that no longer exists, running full speed in a modern context it was not designed for. And once you see it, you can work with it instead of being driven by it. You learned that most of the suffering attached to difficult situations does not come from the situations themselves. It comes from the stories your mind constructs on top of the facts, automatically, instantly, using fear and past experience as raw material, and you can learn to strip those stories back to what is actually true. You learned that emotional regulation is not softness, it is the prerequisite for clear thinking. Calm first, then clarity, then action, in that order, every time. You learned that solution-oriented thinking is a trainable skill made of specific habits, forward questions instead of backward ones, small actions instead of perfect ones, data instead of verdicts. You learned that your mind's default questions under pressure are either pointing you toward movement or keeping you in place, and replacing one set with the other is one of the highest leverage changes available to you. You learned that attention is finite and trainable, and that where you consistently point it determines what grows in your mind. And you learned that lasting change does not come from better techniques alone. It comes from an updated identity, one that expects to handle things, one that moves without certainty, one that finds in difficulty not a threat to survive, but a situation to engage. None of this makes life easier. Problems will keep appearing. Uncertainty will still be uncomfortable. There will still be moments, probably many of them, where the old pull towards spiraling, freezing, or replaying is strong. The difference now is awareness. You will notice the loop. You will notice the story forming. You will notice when the emotional system is trying to run the whole operation. And in that noticing, choice appears. You do not need to change everything at once. You do not need to apply every idea perfectly from today. You only need to do one thing. The next time something difficult appears, pause, take one breath, separate what actually happened from the story forming around it, ask one forward question, take one step. That is it. That is the whole shift. Not once, not dramatically, quietly, consistently, without drama. That is how the mind gets retrained. That is how the identity changes. That is how the person who watches this at midnight because something in their life is not working becomes the person who wakes up tomorrow and moves. People who watch this kind of content fall into two groups: the ones who consume it and move on, and the ones who actually use it. If you are in the second group, if something in the last hour landed and you're already thinking about where to apply it, that's who this channel is built for. If this resonated, hit like and subscribe to Book Blueprint. We break down the ideas that actually change how you think and move through difficulty, one video at a time, no fluff. And here's the open loop I left at the beginning of this video. I told you the mechanism that breaks the loop is not what most people expect. It is not a better strategy, it is not more information, and it is not even a better emotional regulation technique. It is the identity that chooses to use those things, even when it doesn't feel like it. Go back to the hook if you want to hear it differently now. Let me be specific about what we are not doing here. This is not positive thinking. Positive thinking asks you to believe that everything will work out while your circumstances stay the same. That is not what changes outcomes. This is not toxic optimism. Telling yourself everything is fine when things are clearly not fine creates a different kind of paralysis, the paralysis of willful blindness. And this is definitely not a productivity framework. You will not leave here with a morning routine or a 5-step checklist. What you are going to learn is something more fundamental than any of those things. You are going to learn how your mind currently processes difficulty, specifically what it does in the first few seconds when something hard shows up, and how to change that default response into something that actually serves you. The reason this matters is simple. The first few seconds determine almost everything. In the first few seconds after a problem appears, your mind makes an interpretation. Is this a threat? Is this information? Is this a verdict on who I am? Or is this simply a situation that requires a response? That interpretation, made almost entirely below the level of conscious thought, sets the entire trajectory of what follows. If the interpretation is threat, the response is defense. The body tightens, the thinking narrows, the options shrink, and the loop begins. If the interpretation is information, the response is engagement. The body stays relatively settled, the thinking expands, options become visible, and movement becomes possible. Here's the key. That interpretation is not fixed. It is learned, and what is learned can be relearned. Not through willpower, through practice, through building a different mind habit at the moment of difficulty, one small encounter at a time. There's one more thing worth addressing before we move into the 8 chapters. The word problems. In this video, I will use it often, but I want you to hear it differently from how you might usually encounter it. A problem, as I will use the word, is simply any gap between where you are and where you want or need to be. That includes big things: financial pressure, relationship breakdown, career uncertainty, health challenges. And it also includes small things: the project that isn't moving, the conversation you keep avoiding, the decision you know you need to make but haven't. All of these are gaps, and gaps are workable. What makes them feel unworkable is not the size of the gap. It is the interpretation layered on top of the gap. The interpretation that the gap means something is wrong with you, that you should not be here, that someone who had their life together would not be dealing with this. That interpretation is where the suffering lives, and it is almost entirely constructed. Remove it. Learn to see the gap as a gap and not as a judgment, and what remains is almost always manageable. Not easy, but manageable. And manageable is where everything starts. Let's make this even more specific. Here is exactly how to run the 2-column exercise when something difficult hits. Find a piece of paper or open a note on your phone. 2 columns. Label them "What happened" and "What my mind is saying." In the first column, write only what you would describe to someone who wasn't there. Only observable actions and events. No feelings, no interpretations, no intentions attributed to anyone. No predictions about what it means. Just the raw sequence. She didn't respond to my message for 24 hours. That is a fact. In the second column, write everything else. Everything your mind has said, implied, or concluded about that fact. She is angry with me. She thinks I'm annoying. This always happens when I try to open up. I am the kind of person people eventually pull away from. I'm going to be alone. I'm falling behind everyone else socially. Look at those 2 columns side by side. One contains 20 words. The other contains a novel. And the novel is what your nervous system has been responding to as though it were as real as the 20 words. This is the inefficiency at the heart of most emotional suffering. We expend enormous energy managing emotional responses to things that have not happened, are not confirmed, were constructed from incomplete information, and are frequently inaccurate. Once you see it laid out this way, the path forward becomes much clearer. Not easier, clearer. Challenge the column 2 items, not the column 1 facts. Ask, is this the only possible interpretation of what happened in column 1? Ask, what would someone who cared about me say if they read column 2? Ask, how many of these items in column 2 have actually been confirmed versus assumed? You will almost always find that at least some of the items in column 2, often most of them, are based on pattern recognition from the past, not from evidence from the present. Your mind reached back into its archive of similar experiences and pulled out the most emotionally resonant explanation it could find. That is what minds do. It is not a failure of yours. It is a feature. But features can be examined, and examined features lose their automatic authority. One more piece here. The goal is not to replace every negative story with a positive one. That is the mistake that makes reframing feel hollow to most intelligent people. The goal is accuracy. Sometimes the column 2 items, when examined, turn out to be partially true. And if they are, they deserve to be dealt with from a clear, steady place, not from inside an emotional storm. Sometimes they turn out to be entirely unfounded, built from fear and past experience, not from what is actually present. In either case, knowing which one you are dealing with is the first step to knowing what to actually do about it. Accuracy. That is the goal. Not optimism, not suppression. Accuracy. Consider the most capable person you know. The person who handles hard situations with a kind of calm steadiness that makes you wonder what they know that you don't. Here is what they know. They are not more confident than you. They have not had fewer failures. In many cases, they have had significantly more, because people who take more action, take more swings, and move forward earlier in the process inevitably run into more things that don't work the first time. But they have built a fundamentally different relationship with failure. For most people, a failure is a data point with a story attached. The story says, this tells you something about your capability, your worth, your likelihood of future success. For solution-oriented thinkers, a failure is just a data point. This approach did not work in this situation, under these conditions. What does that tell me about what to try next? No story, no verdict, no shame cycle. Just information about adjustment. Here is the practical difference. When failure is a verdict, the cost of attempting anything goes up dramatically, because every attempt risks another verdict, and verdicts accumulate into a self-image. When failure is data, the cost drops towards zero, because the outcome, whatever it is useful. A yes means continue, a no means adjust. Both are progress. This is not a trick of framing. It is a functional description of how knowledge actually advances. Science runs on this principle. Every experiment, including the ones that disprove a hypothesis, advances understanding. Failed hypotheses are not failures of the scientists. They are contributions to the field. Your attempts at difficult things work the same way. One more thing about the solution-oriented relationship with outcomes. It does not require detachment. You are allowed to care deeply about the result. You are allowed to feel disappointed when something does not go as planned. Feeling disappointment is healthy and honest. The difference is what you do with the disappointment. Problem-oriented minds use disappointment as further evidence of the story. More proof that the risk was not worth it. More confirmation of what they suspected about themselves. Solution-oriented minds feel the disappointment, acknowledge it, and then ask, given what I now know, what is the best next move? One extends the loop, the other closes it. Here is something most people do not realize about how attention gets trained. They assume focus is built during intense, dedicated practice, meditation, deep work sessions, concentration exercises. And those help, but attention is being trained or degraded in every single moment of every day. Not just during the big focused sessions. When you eat a meal while scrolling your phone, you are training split attention. You are reinforcing the habit of being somewhere else than where your body is. When you have a conversation but are simultaneously composing your next response before the other person has finished speaking, you are training incomplete presence. When you sit down to work and toggle between tasks every 4 minutes, you are training the brain to be constantly elsewhere, to treat the current task as a waypoint rather than a destination. These habits accumulate. They become the default setting. The reversal is not complicated, but it requires intention. When you eat, eat, not as a spiritual exercise, as a deliberate practice of being where you are. When someone is talking to you, listen, not to gather information for your response, but to actually receive what they are communicating. When you are doing one task, do it. Not perfectly or with perfect focus from minute 1, but with the intention of noticing when your attention drifts and returning it. Each return is one repetition of trained attention. It is not the length of the focus that builds the skill, it is the noticing and returning. A person who notices their attention has drifted 40 times during a 30-minute task and returns it 40 times has done 40 repetitions of the most important attentional exercise available. That is more training than someone who stares at a screen for 30 minutes while mentally elsewhere. Over time, weeks and months of this practice, the space between drifts grows. The pull toward distraction weakens. The ability to stay with something through difficulty increases. Not because willpower increased, because the attentional muscle was trained. This is not dramatic change, it is gradual change. The kind that compounds quietly, and then one day you realize you are different in a way that is hard to trace back to a single moment. That kind of change is the most reliable kind. And it begins with the next moment of full presence you choose to give something. I want to be clear about something before this chapter ends. The goal of this framework is not to become someone who never feels overwhelmed. Feeling overwhelmed is a human response. It will happen. It is not evidence of failure, it is evidence of caring about things and being affected by difficulty in ways that are completely natural. The goal is not to eliminate that experience. The goal is to reduce how long it takes you to move through it, to shrink the gap between something difficult happened and I am taking the next step. That gap, for most untrained minds, can be hours, days, sometimes weeks, filled with rumination, avoidance, replaying, and the kind of mental exhaustion that has nothing to do with how much physical work got done. For a trained mind, that gap shrinks, not to zero, but significantly. This is why the identity piece is the final chapter and not the first one. You needed the tools first, the facts from stories distinction, the calm before clarity sequence, the forward questions, the attention training, the small steps. Because the identity is built from those tools, used repeatedly until they stop feeling like tools and start feeling like who you are. That is the transition. From I know these things to I am someone who does these things. From technique to identity. From effort to automatic. You are not going to wake up tomorrow as a completely different person. But you might wake up tomorrow and when the first difficult thing appears, the email that requires a hard decision, the conversation you have been avoiding, the task that feels overwhelming, notice something slightly different. A pause before the spiral. A moment before the story fully forms. A question that points forward instead of backward. That pause is everything. That pause is where the new identity lives. And every time you choose it, even slightly, even imperfectly, it grows stronger. Here is the paradox in its most direct form. The state you enter when you are most focused on a problem, the heightened, activated, stress-flooded state, is the state that most reliably prevents you from solving it. You are not failing to think clearly because you are not trying hard enough. You are failing to think clearly because the chemistry of intense problem focus actively shuts down the brain systems responsible for clarity. This is not a personal weakness. It is human biology behaving exactly as it was designed to behave. But understanding it gives you something most people never have. A reason to slow down that is not about being soft, not about giving up, not about not caring enough. The reason is strategic. You slow down because a slower, steadier approach gives you access to the cognitive tools that the stressed, flooded approach systematically denies you. Now here's the second layer of the paradox, the one that explains why people get stuck in the loop for so long even after they intellectually understand that the loop is not helping them. Staying in the loop feels like doing something. The brain, under stress, is generating enormous amounts of activity. Thoughts are firing rapidly, scenarios are running, conclusions are being drawn, revised, discarded, redrawn. All of that activity feels like engagement. It feels like productivity. It mimics the experience of working hard on something, but it is producing no output. Think about the last time you spent 2 hours thinking about a difficult thing. At the end of those 2 hours, had your situation changed? Had a call been placed? Had any single external thing shifted? Usually no, but you felt exhausted as though you had worked hard. Because in a very real sense you had. You had spent 2 hours running your mental hardware at high intensity. The problem is that none of that intensity was directed at anything productive. It was directed at the problem as an object of contemplation, not as a situation requiring a specific response. The loop feels like effort. It registers as work in the brain's accounting system, but it produces no output. This is one of the reasons mental exhaustion without visible cause is so common among high-achieving, self-aware people. They care, they think hard, they are fully engaged with their challenges, but they are engaged in a way that consumes resources without generating results. The shift that changes this, and we'll get into the mechanics of it in detail in chapters 5 and 6, is not about thinking less. It is about redirecting the same energy toward a different target. Not what is wrong with my situation, but what is available in my situation. Not why am I here, but what does here require. The mind is already running at full speed. You just need to change the direction it is pointed. And once that direction shifts, even slightly, even temporarily, something important happens. The problem stops being something that is happening to you. It starts being something you are working on. That shift in orientation is not a small thing. The emotional experience of being at the mercy of a problem is fundamentally different from the emotional experience of actively engaging with one. One feels like drowning, the other feels like swimming. Same water, completely different experience. Before we dive in, I want to be direct about who this is for. If you're someone who processes emotions by thinking through them carefully, you're probably here. If you have a tendency to analyze situations from every angle before making a move, you're definitely here. This is not about becoming impulsive or abandoning careful thought. It is about learning when careful thought serves you, and when the thing that looks like careful thought is actually your mind finding increasingly sophisticated ways to stay exactly where it is. Because that second thing is real, and it's common, and it's quiet enough that most people who do it never realize it. That's what we're addressing. And here's the piece that will make the rest of this stick. This is not information that changes your life by being understood. It changes your life by being practiced. You will hear the concepts, but the shift happens in the doing. Keep that in mind as we go through each chapter and look for the one thing in each section that you can apply before this video ends.